started. So you have a couple options before I get started. You have a couple options as we're going through this. The first thing that I will say to you is my goal for today is to keep this educational so you know what to look for and the things that are most important. I know that hormones, they're very, very complex, which is why even doctors are just like, oh, we're not going to run that. It's because they don't know. It's like, Michael, thank you. I hate mispronouncing people's names because most people mispronounce my last name. So thank you, Michael. So the point is that I want to make sure that you guys don't feel overwhelmed by this. So I want to keep it simple enough to where it's like, listen, these are the things specific to women in midlife that you should look out for so that you get used to like looking at what a lab report looks like, because the reality is that your general practitioner, your OBGYN, they are not trained in this stuff. They don't receive any education on what your hormones are going to do as you're going into perimenopause and then into postmenopause. They don't receive training on that. Their standard of care literally is give them birth control to help manage some of the symptoms in terms of hot flashes. And if they are feeling kind of down, give them an antidepressant. So my goal is to give you enough information to where you know better. You know what your options are, you know how to look at a report, you know how to ask for a report, and give you enough education that you can now start to advocate for your own health and well-being. I'm going to give you some documents that you can take with you that will help you understand some of this. So I'll kind of browse over, kind of go through some of those really quick. But I want you to have those. And again, I want to keep it simple enough that it doesn't overwhelm you. So we are going to get started. So the first thing to understand that in relation, you guys can feel free to jump into the chat and ask questions as we go along. I'll try to catch them, but I do have like a lot of things popping up. So if I don't catch it, just keep dinging me. The first thing to understand is when it comes to midlife hormones, is that there's kind of a cascade of how this all happens. And due to lifestyle, I would say the most common thing that we see before you're hitting that perimenopause is that you may see some insulin issues, you may see some inflammation. But once you start moving into that perimenopause, and I'm going to explain what happens, as those sex hormones start to drop down, what you need to understand is that hormones don't work in a vacuum. They work together. And what they do, their action, is highly dependent upon who else is in the room. That's how I always describe it, right? So depending upon what other hormones are around, that will help determine what that action is going to be taken. It's kind of like, I use the analogy like you probably behave a little bit differently at work than you do at home around your kids. They work the same way. Hormones work the same way. We also don't want to look at just one marker. One marker alone doesn't really tell us a whole lot. We want to look at them as a whole and see what's happening. Now, in midlife, as we go through this transition, something to keep in mind is as those hormones start to drop off, what happens is your adrenals have to start picking up the load. So where your gonads or your sex hormone, your sex organs used to produce those hormones, your adrenals now have to kick in, and they're going to start to try and produce some of these hormones as well. At some point, they try to take over. Over time, that puts a stress on your adrenal system, right? So keep that in mind. As you go through this process of estrogen dropping off, as progesterone dropping off, you are going to become less stress resilient. You will become less insulin sensitive. And here's how this happens. And I learned this a long time ago, and it's the best way that I learned to figure out like estrogen and progesterone and what this means and how they work. So I want you to think of estrogen and progesterone as twin sisters. I learned this FYI by Dr. Jade Teta. If you guys want to look him up, he's a master at hormones and metabolism, and he's great at helping people understand on a very simple level. So estrogen and progesterone are twin sisters, but they're not identical sisters. Estrogen is your vibrancy hormone. She's the extrovert. She likes to go out. She likes to try new things. She's very vibrant and energetic. She can handle more carbs and food. She's much more stress resilient. She likes to just go do things. Now, left to her own devices, she can get in a little bit of trouble because she's like, oh yeah, let's just go do it. Right, which is why she needs her twin sister, progesterone, to help balance her out. Progesterone is the introvert. She's the calming hormone. She's also the one that's a little bit like, I don't think we should be doing that. That doesn't seem safe. She's the worrier, right? So together, they work out really, really well. Now, if you think about this during a cycle, kind of relate this to if you had a cycle, when you had a cycle, or if you still do, PMS is kind of like menopause, right? So what happens is right before your period, both of those hormones take a dip. So you no longer have your vibrancy, energetic hormone, but you also don't have your calm hormone. They're both gone. So now all of a sudden life feels a little bit heavier. You just kind of like, I'm not as motivated. I'm worrying. I'm more anxious. I'm not sleeping as well. I'm bloated all the time and I'm craving sugar, right? Like that's that whole PMS thing. Now, as you start your period, that cycle, what happens is estrogen is going to rise faster. And so what will happen is typically as she starts to rise, everything feels better. You are more energetic. You feel good. You take on more. You handle things better. You had a client earlier today. She's like, I could tell things just really kicked in last week. I'm like, when did you have your cycle? And she's like, oh yeah, that was probably three days in. I'm like, thank you, estrogen. She kicked her energy up. She was like, I was eating more food and I haven't gained any weight. Like that's what estrogen will do. So she's rising faster than progesterone. And then she'll start to drop off. Progesterone comes up, and then they do this little dance, and then they both just start to come back down. They work together. Now, as you go through perimenopause into menopause, here's what happens. Your sex hormones start to drop off. The first two typically are going to be progesterone, who is your calming hormone. So all of a sudden you start having a harder time sleeping. All of a sudden you start noticing you're more anxious, right? So that starts dropping off. Your calming sister is out. She's not around to take care of her sister. And because she's no longer looking after her sister, my extrovert over here doesn't have anybody watching over her. She's out there having a good time and she's partying. Here's the problem is estrogen doesn't just slowly drop off like her sister. She's what I use the analogy. It's like, if you guys remember those videos, Girls Gone Wild, I think that was like in the 80s or 90s, right? Like that's estrogen and perimenopause. And it's why some of you have heard from your doctor, it doesn't do any good to test when you're in perimenopause. And the reason that they're saying that is because your estrogen could be low in the morning and high in the evening. It's why you feel 1 minute you're weepy and crying, and the next minute you're about to get a divorce because you lost your shit when you're talking to your partner, right? Like you're done. You just don't have any patience with anybody. You know you're irritable, and then the next second you're crying again. Then you just think life is terrible, and you just feel like a mess. That is because estrogen is doing this. She's moving around. Now, estrogen, when she drops, makes you less stress resilient. She also has an effect on your cell's ability to process insulin. It makes those cells less sensitive to the message of insulin. So that is the cascade. That's why I say hormones don't work in a vacuum. They work together. So hopefully that makes sense. So as we're going through this, couple things to keep in mind. And the first thing that I'm going to give you is what panels do I even ask for? Because most doctors are not going to run everything that you want to have. So let me pull this up and see if I can find it. There's a million of these screens. Recommended lab testing. Yep. Okay. Let's make sure you guys can see that. No, that's not it. This guy. Yep. Okay. So you guys can see that okay, right? I can't see. I've got a lot of these open. So I'll check back after I go through this. so that you guys can, let me try doing this. Okay. Let me put this over here. You guys can still see that. Okay. So I'm going to go through this really quick. And so you guys, what I'll do is in the email that follows, you guys will actually get a copy of this. So you can actually print this off and take it to your provider. So the basics, and I'm going to walk you through the things that they typically will run. They're going to typically run on an annual exam, a CBC and a CMP. That's pretty standard. A CBC is a complete blood count. A CMP is a comprehensive metabolic panel. And what these two are basically looking for, this is a very general statement. A CBC is going to look for things like, it's going to look for infection. It's going to look for inflammation. It's going to look for anemia, things like that. That's what your CBC is going to look for. Your CMP is looking for markers that let us know how your body is processing food into energy. So that's why it's a metabolic panel. Hopefully that makes sense. Those are pretty standard. Insulin, how high is your insulin? Are your cells pulling that insulin in and using it? Or do you have too much insulin in your system? Too much insulin in your system eventually gets stored as fat, and over time leads down the path towards diabetes, type 2 diabetes. So they're going to look at insulin. That's pretty standard. Ferritin is basically the way that they look to see how much iron you have in your system. So ferritin is kind of the storage tank for iron. So they're going to look at that. Hemoglobin A1C is basically looking at your blood sugar over a 3-month period of time. So they're averaging that out. So keep in mind, another reason why doctors will say, hormones fluctuate, it doesn't matter. That's true. They do fluctuate, particularly things like blood sugar. Literally minute by minute, they will, if you know anybody with type 1 diabetes and they have to monitor this, they will tell you it is minute by minute, like they're constantly having to make adjustments because your blood sugar does alter based on stress, food, movement, sleep, all of those things, right? So they're looking at it over a period of time so they can get a better idea of what this looks like. Your lipid panel is basically cholesterol or fat in the blood. We do need that fat for basic cellular molecular function. So it's not that those are bad. None of them are actually bad, even though they call some of them good and bad. They're all needed. They all have a need, but we want to make sure that they're not building up over time. Vitamin D5, or vitamin D, is also important. I will tell you with vitamin D, I see a lot of clients that come in with it really, really low. And typically good signs that are indicative of low vitamin D is like energy levels. You'll notice that. Also, as you start to have some sex hormonal issues, vitamin D will get kind of tapped. So if you live in Seattle like I do, and you don't get enough sun, vitamin D will be pretty low. I'll give you ranges on that. C-reactive protein is a inflammation marker. So far, the ones that I've shown you, those are pretty standard. They won't always run vitamin D, but you can ask for it and they will usually run that one. If you ask for C-reactive protein, they will typically run that one as well, but they don't automatically run it unless you have a history of having your lipids off. Then sometimes they'll throw that off. They'll throw that in there. Cortisol, sometimes they'll run it, sometimes they won't. This one is a little bit misleading because cortisol actually has a natural circadian rhythm. So what wakes you up, if you didn't have an alarm that woke you up in the morning, it would be cortisol that wakes you up. If you are in midlife and you wake up in the middle of the night and you're wide awake, that's cortisol. Cortisol is waking you up. It's creating an awakening response. It works opposite to melatonin, right? So when melatonin is high, cortisol is low, and cortisol is high, melatonin is low. So elevated cortisol creates an awakening response. So that should be what wakes you up first thing in the morning. Now, as it climbs, it will peak usually 60 to 90 minutes, somewhere in there after you wake up, and then it will start to come back down. As we're testing cortisol in relation to blood serum, they're just going to test it first thing in the morning if you're doing a fasting test. So you can get a cortisol test. I look at it, it's probably not super accurate because you're not getting the rhythm. You're not getting the whole circadian rhythm of that. Thyroid. These are the ones, I'd say there's 3 for sure that you want, and then you can get expansive over that. Most doctors are only going to run TSH. You want free T3 and free T4. And when I show you my lab panels, I'll explain why you want all of them. From sex hormones, we want free and total testosterone. We want estradiol, which is E2. There are 3 different estrogen panels. We definitely want estradiol. It's the most active, has the most effect on your system. We want progesterone. We want SHBG, which is sex hormone binding globulin. It is the protein that binds those sex hormones. DHEAs are what actually create those hormones. So that's pretty important. If that's low, your estrogen, your progesterone, your testosterone, those are going to all be low. And then your luteinizing hormone and your FSH. FSH is the follicle stimulating hormone. It is the one that stimulates those hormones to go. So you can always tell, and I'll show you what it looks like on a panel. FSH tells you, it doesn't tell you, but it can kind of give you a clue how close you might be getting to actual menopause. And I'll show you mine so you guys can see that. So again, you guys will get a copy of this so you can actually print this out, take it to your doctor and be like, these are the panels that I want. And you'll see I'm actually going to show you my lab panels. You'll see all of those panels that are in there. Let me make sure I'm not missing anything. Notes. Okay. Now let's talk about the difference between conventional, there we go, conventional and functional ranges. And this is important because I cannot tell you the number of times that I have a client come to me saying, my doctor said everything's fine. And some of you, have you guys ever heard this? I feel like crap. I went to my doctor, they checked and they said, everything's great. Here is why they're saying that. So there's a difference between, and I'm not going to go through these line by line, but I want to give you an idea of what to look for. You will also get a copy of this so you can see what this actually looks like. So when we look at conventional, or what some call Western medical ranges, I want you to keep in mind that those ranges are based on everybody. Those that are healthy and those that are really, really not. If you think about it, and you look at everybody in the United States right now, we have about a 35 to 40% obesity rate. We have people who are walking around who are not healthy. Everybody's included in these ranges. And these ranges are also designed to look for a disease state. They're not designed to help you prevent the disease state. That's the difference. What's called a functional range, which is this column here. Hopefully it's sharing the right thing. Make sure. Sometimes it doesn't switch over. Okay. The functional range, also known as an optimal range, and these are pretty standard. Sometimes you'll see them kind of move just a little bit, so don't get hung up on like 1 or 2 digits on these ranges. But these are pretty standard functional or optimal ranges. They are designed to look at the body as a whole and also to tell you if you are headed towards a disease state. So we'll just take glucose for a quick example, is that for most conventional doctors, they won't really address any kind of glucose issue unless you're showing like above 100. You already have an issue if you're above 100. And then they might just put you on like metformin. Glucose in an optimal range means that you're between 75 and 86. So we want it lower to avoid that whole thing in the first place. Things like sodium, potassium, a lot of times they'll just dismiss those. Another one that I see a lot is AST and ALT. This one actually just came through with a client. Her AST and her ALT were both in the 40s, and her doctor did not say anything. And her alkaline phosphatase was above 117. Doctor did not say a word about this. This has to do with liver function, right? So when we're looking at it as a whole, and I'll show you, I think I can show you part of it. You can see that like as a whole, there's an issue. There's a problem that's coming up. So you guys will get a copy of this as well, so you can actually see the differences. And that way, when you get your lab report back, you can be like, okay, which am I looking at? And the way that I've always done these prior to the software that I have now is I would go through and I would just highlight anything that was out of a functional range. And then I would connect the dots. If I had more than one marker that indicated liver dysfunction, then I start to group those together. Anything that's cardiovascular related, I group those together. Because if there's not more than one, it's just like, okay, let's just keep an eye on it, not panic, and check every 6 months to make sure we're okay. But if you see 3 or 4 that are like, hey, this indicates that you may have this issue, then I would say you probably should address it. Hopefully that makes sense. Does anybody have any questions so far? Am I confusing you? Am I going too fast? Is this helpful? I want to make sure that this makes sense to you guys. Okay, nothing so far. All good. Thank you, Michael. Okay, so I'm actually going to show you, I'm going to try and make sure I pull up the right one here. I'm going to show you my recent labs. So you guys can see I'm not showing anybody else's stuff. It's just mine. These were labs that were done. This. Make sure pull it up. Get rid of this guy. Okay, are you guys seeing something that says functional health report? It's got my picture on it. I think that it's got it. Okay, I think we're good. Okay. So this is, I have a software system that I use now for clients that makes it easier for them to read. So when I would do it before, I realized that it was overwhelming in terms of them trying to remember like, oh, it's this, or whatever. So this is very clear in like, these are the issues that we really want to address. And that's why I like this system. So this is my, my report from May 31st. Now, just a little background. I am 52 years old. I will tell you probably 2.5, 3 years ago, probably 3 years ago, is when I first had my big wave of like perimenopausal symptoms. Prior to that, things that I had noticed was that I just wasn't recovering as well. I did have to adjust my workouts. I didn't have the energy that I used to have. My joints did kind of start to get achy, but they were all things that I kind of just brushed off. It's fine. You work a lot. It's fine. That was my stance. You're fine. It's fine. Right? Just keep going. And then it was towards the end of that particular year, I hit a huge, huge dip. And I could no longer sleep. I no longer was motivated to do anything. And I'm a type A, very ambitious person. So for me to not want to do, like, I didn't want to leave the house. I wasn't sleeping well. I was super bloated. I was craving everything. I would cry at anything. I did not feel like myself. It was like a very drastic change. So I did what everybody does. I made an appointment with my doctor and I went in thinking, oh, this is great, because I showed up and it was a woman in her 60s, I'm guessing. I'm thinking, she must totally understand what this is all about. And I was wrong, because she wouldn't run any of this stuff. She would only run my lipids, my insulin, and my CBC and my CMP. She would not even entertain running my estrogen. And we actually ended up going back and forth verbally on it, because she was trying to convince me that, number one, it fluctuates, so it doesn't matter, which it does matter. And number two, that she didn't even know which one to order, that there's so many of them. I was like, I'll tell you which one to order. And she still wouldn't order it. So I was very, very frustrated. Got a functional doctor, had gone through this whole process and started to feel better. And it is a process, guys, if you are looking at HRT. It doesn't happen overnight. It's not a slap a patch on and you're better, the way that some people make it sound. It is definitely a process. So just know that. And then started to do better. Not as great as I was, but was doing better. And then at the beginning of this year, I hit my second really big dip. I was just like, oh my gosh, I had started feeling better. I really felt like things were clearing out. I knew I needed to get retested and needed to get my HRT and things redone, because I knew that my levels were dropping. And now at that point, we had done something. I'll show you when I go through this. But I hit another big dip at the beginning of this year. And so this is from May, when I was like hot flash city, which I hadn't had before, was not sleeping, miserable, unmotivated, super puffy, bloated, like just felt awful. And so this is when we got these panels done. So this was just the end of May. Now, this is a very long report. Like if you look at it, does it even say? It's 41 pages. I'm just going to highlight some of this so that I don't bore you with some of the stuff you don't need to know. At the very beginning, it just talks about why we do blood serum testing. But I'm going to walk you through. And what I love about using this software is that it groups things together. So now you can see, like if we're looking at all of these panels, we can see across the board which ones are alarming high, which ones are high, which ones are low, like where are the ones that are most important? And also they're grouped together instead of just, if you look at a standard lab sheet, like if I show you like a standard lab sheet, the way that they're listed, it makes no sense. They're not grouped together. So somebody who isn't trained to know what to look for is just like, I have no idea what this means. So the way that we put these together, all of these that you see here have to do with blood glucose. So now we can see, are we in range? And we can see, is there one or is it a trend? So for me, my blood glucose was, it's normally optimal. It's normally like low 80s. But because I was going through this wacky transition, I knew my blood glucose was off. I was having cravings out the roof and I was trying to manage them as best as I could, but I was definitely eating more sweets than I normally do. And because I was so tired and achy all the time, I wasn't lifting as much, which will 100% affect your glucose levels. So that was elevated a little bit, but overall we're doing okay. Then we look at things like BUN, creatinine, your EGFR, things like that. Those all have to do with kidney function. So if you guys want to write these down, you can. But see how they're grouped together? So now we can look overall, how are our kidneys doing instead of these random numbers? Electrolytes, these are important for multiple reasons. Most doctors are not going to address this with you. But if you are someone who works out a lot, or if you're someone who lives someplace where you sweat a lot, you notice that you're just tired all the time, things like that. What you need to understand is that, number one, if you're drinking water and you don't have enough electrolytes in your system, that water is not going to get pulled into the cell. So you're just going to pee that stuff right back out. So you're not going to be hydrated, which affects every other system in your body, right? So like these are all of your electrolytes: sodium, potassium, chloride, CO2, and then the sodium potassium combination ratio, right? So those matter as well. Then you've got your metabolic system. This one, your anion gap, the reason that mine is elevated has to do with chronic stress. Keep in mind, my body was going through a lot of stress at this point. Also, I'm a business owner. So that's what that is adrenal stress. Then you've got your proteins. So when you're looking at these, most of these are going to show up under your CBC. So we're looking at those. Then we're looking at minerals. And then I'm going to go to liver function, liver and gallbladder function. So you can see, remember I was telling you the client that I just went through, her alkaline phosphatase, her AST, her ALT were all elevated. And you'll see, like, I'll show you how like it groups them together to show like if there is an actual problem. Your liver is what clears everything out, and it's where you metabolize. So if you are having a hard time metabolizing food, if you're having a hard time metabolizing hormones, if you're on hormone therapy and you're not metabolizing it well, it could be that you're having some liver dysfunction. If you don't eat mostly whole foods and you're eating a lot of processed foods, it's going to take a toll on your liver. Your liver is very resilient, but at some point it slows everything down. So that's why we look at your liver and gallbladder function, your ferritin, your iron markers, and then your lipids. Again, when we're looking at these, what we are looking at is basically fat in the blood. Your body does need those fats, but we want to make sure that it's not layering up, it's not plaquing up in the arteries. So we look at your lipids first. They are not always, just so you know, the best way to indicate cardiovascular disease. Your lipids will change. It is not uncommon for women who are going through perimenopause into menopause to have elevated cholesterol. It's pretty typical, so don't freak out about it. You're looking at it as a whole. We're looking at all of them. The one marker that has the most effect, that shows the most realistic determination of cardiovascular disease, is actually triglycerides. If your triglycerides are elevated, then you know that, okay, we've got to really take a look at this, especially your triglycerides to HDL ratio. That is a good marker of cardiovascular health, not just your cholesterol. Your lipoproteins, this also shows plaque buildup. So sometimes they'll run ApoB, sometimes they won't. Again, it just kind of goes into that whole section. And then we're going to talk about thyroid. And I'm going to explain how this works. Most doctors are only, number one, let me back up. 1 in 4, it's estimated, 1 in 4, 1 in 5, somewhere around there, women in midlife have some level of thyroid dysfunction. I'm one of them. It's a small level, but at some point, a great deal of us will have some kind of dysfunction with our thyroid, and most doctors are going to completely dismiss it because, number one, if you go back and look at the functional ranges versus conventional ranges, they're going to go off conventional ranges, which means that you could still be in dysfunction. Second reason is that they're just going to look at TSH. So here's how this works. It starts in your brain. So there is something called a hypothalamus. It's in your brain. And I want you to imagine it like a control center. I always imagine it like the guy at the airport, like there is one. Like there's this guy at the airport sitting up in the tower, and he's responsible for everything going on. He's responsible for every plane coming in, every plane going out, which gate they're going to, the weather, like everything. He's just sitting here watching it all. And then he's got this right-hand guy, and that right-hand guy's name is the pituitary gland. He sits right next to him. So when he sees things, he's like, hey, make sure that this plane goes to this gate. You got to move that over. Hey, there's a weather pattern over here. Make sure you tell them that they need to go around. Tell this guy to go fly a little higher, right? So he's sending the messages to the pituitary gland, and then the pituitary gland talks to the team. Does that make sense? So when it comes to your thyroid, it is they call it the HPT axis. It is your hypothalamus, pituitary gland, thyroid axis. So hypothalamus says, we need more thyroid. And so pituitary guy goes, got it. So he sends a signal and is like, stimulate more thyroid. That is TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. It's a stimulating hormone. It only stimulates. It doesn't do anything else. Now, TSH is going to get converted to T4. T4 is like a storage bank. And then part of that is what's called free T4. And it's like the ultimate storage bank, if you will. So it's holding this TSH, this hormone. It's holding it. It doesn't do anything. It's not doing anything for your metabolism. All it's doing is holding it. This guy, free T3, the one that your doctor will not run, is the one doing it's what we call the workhorse. It is the one having the greatest effect on your metabolic system. T3, free T3, I should say, free T3 is the thyroid hormone that is doing all of the metabolic work. Now, what can happen is then that T3, free T3, sends a message, loops back up to your brain, to the pituitary gland, and then says, I either have enough thyroid stimulating hormone or I don't. Here's what can happen. TSH gets produced. It goes to T4, but doesn't quite convert the way that we think it's going to. So there's stuff leaking, the storage doesn't hold, and then it doesn't convert correctly to T3. And then free T3. So then free T3 says, I don't have enough, I need more thyroid hormone. So it sends a message back up to the pituitary gland and it's like, make more. Okay. So what can happen is your TSH levels can be okay or even elevated, and your doctor say, you're fine. But if they're not checking your free T3, you don't know if you're converting. And most doctors, even if they do start to look at this, most doctors, not all, most doctors will only prescribe things that affect TSH and maybe free T4. Most of them don't look at free T3. And if you're not getting enough, what's going to happen is it's just going to keep sending that feedback loop saying, I need more TSH. And the whole time your system thinks, I just need more TSH, your doctor thinks everything's fine. And on mine, if you look, TSH is a little low. My free T4 is optimal, but this is how we knew I'm right at the edge. I normally am right in optimal. Prior to perimenopause, I was right in optimal, and now I'm right at that below optimal. And so when I had a discussion with my physician, it was like, do you want to address this? And I wanted to address other things first and do it naturally. So I'm doing things, I'm eating things that have selenium in them, which helps support the thyroid, but it's not the thing that I want to focus on the most right out of the gate. So that's what you need to know about thyroid, okay? Inflammation, your C-reactive protein, they won't always run this one. It is one that I always tell my ladies to run because when we're looking at cardiovascular health and inflammation, C-reactive protein with a combination of your ApoB, those are good indicators of whether you have cardiovascular risk factors, especially when you combine that with things like insulin, fasting insulin, and glucose levels. Vitamin D. So most doctors, I think, conventional levels are much lower. Doesn't show it on this one. Optimal levels are between 50 and 90. I like between 80 and 90. I kind of like to stay in that range. If you are low in vitamin D, you will be tired. I get a lot of ladies that come in and they're like 15, 20, 30, and I'm like, vitamin D up. Like you just don't have enough. You will be very, very tired. A lot of doctors will be afraid to prescribe it. It's definitely not a more is better thing because vitamin D can convert to estrogen if you get too much, and especially if you're in perimenopause, you don't want to feed that estrogen because it's so volatile. We don't need anything that's shooting her up any higher. Even though sometimes she might be low, we don't want to shoot her up any higher. So we want to make sure that we're staying in that optimal range. Something to consider in sunlight, make sure you're getting enough sunlight. DHEAs, again, that's what produces those sex hormones. So when you're looking at this, my DHEAs were low. So of course my estrogen and progesterone were low. And FSH is the one that I was talking about. This is a follicle stimulating hormone. It stimulates those sex hormones. Now, everybody knows that the definition of menopause is once you hit that 12-month mark. But when you're looking at FSH, it can sometimes tell a little bit of a story of how close you are getting to menopause. The last time we looked at, and usually the range, it'll vary a little bit, but somewhere around 25 to 30 is kind of the mark where it's like, oh yeah, you're there. You're at menopause. We just got to wait for the 12 months, right? 25 to 30 is pretty standard. The last time we checked my FSH, it was at 15. And that was just like, oh man, I got a ways to go. I thought I was closer than I was. And my practitioner and I both looked at it and was like, okay, I got a ways to go. When we checked it this time, I was at almost 50. So I haven't had a cycle in 4 months. I now just have to wait this out. I don't think I'm going to get a period. I started on elevated, higher level dose of HRT, and I still haven't had a period. So I don't think that I'm going to get one. But basically, FSH is just like it recognizes that you don't have enough estrogen and progesterone and testosterone. It doesn't have enough, so it's like trying to stimulate. So it goes up in an effort to get those hormones to go higher. Hopefully that makes sense. Oops, let me go. Went the wrong way. Testosterone was low. This is something that a lot of doctors won't even look at. And I get a lot of women, actually the one I just looked at, her free testosterone was at like 1.2, something like that. Like it's down here. I'm just like, I don't know how she's functioning, right? Like testosterone is also a vibrancy hormone. Yes, it helps with your libido, but it also is a vibrancy hormone. It gives you energy. And what most women don't know is that prior to perimenopause, of our sex hormones, we have more testosterone than estrogen. It is the hormone that we have the most of. Most women are not taught that. So it is an important hormone to have. So those are the sex hormones. So if you look, my estradiol, if you look, 14.2 is non-existent. My progesterone was down here. It's also non-existent. So really, this is just a waiting game at this point. And again, it explains why I was having hot flashes, why I was just a nightmare at that point. CBC, this is going to be your complete blood count. This is also, again, where we're going to look at things like inflammation, infection, things like that. So we're looking at, again, overall what's happening here. I think that was it. And then what's cool, like these, when I do the software, when we do labs side by side over time, it will actually show us like how it's improving. Like it'll lay it out over time so we can see like what improvements we're making. But I wanted to show you what this looks like so you understand. Stop. Let's do it this way. This one, no. The assessment is that it's these. That when we look at the body as a whole and not just one marker, we can now see what our probability of dysfunction is instead of just letting things go. So for me, my thyroid function probability was likely at this point if I don't do something about it. My blood sugar regulation would possibly be an issue if I didn't do something about it. Just starting to feel better. My nutrition is a little bit better. I'm lifting again. Like I'm not worried about my blood sugar, but I will certainly keep an eye on it. And then you can see, like, even though when you saw some of those markers that were slightly elevated or slightly not, like maybe not high enough, you can see that you look at it and you go, okay, like it's not the most important thing. It allows you to focus on the things that are the most imperative, most important thing to look at. And then when you're looking at it, like with thyroid function, it'll tell you, here's the rationale why we say you have a probability for thyroid dysfunction. My TSH was low, my free T3 was low. Blood sugar regulation, it was looking at fasting glucose, my DHEAs were low, so those are connected. I think there was another one in here. My pH balance was a little bit off. I need to eat a few more greens. And then nutrient status, you can see that in here. There's my DHEA. So when I went to my practitioner and we looked at this, part of the reason is that I'm going through perimenopause into menopause, but my DHEA was so low, and he doesn't always prescribe DHEA, or was so low that he decided to give me a little bit of DHEA to kind of help things along as well. So you can figure out, like, okay, where is your greatest need? What do we need to focus on? Hopefully that makes sense. So questions so far. Hopefully that makes sense. But I wanted to show you really quick the things that I see the most of. And this is the client that I was just telling you about. I'm not going to share her entire lab because I haven't had a chance to make it anonymous yet. Let me see, make sure. There we go. There we go. Nope, that's still me. Hold on. Try that again. There we go. Make sure sometimes Zoom does not cross over. So hopefully you guys can see this. This is just the functional body systems that shows the probability of dysfunction. And she has some other things that I'm definitely going to address with her. But when we look at it, these are all things that were dismissed by her doctor. Number one, when her blood sugar, her insulin was at 115. So we know that that's elevated. All of her lipids were really out of whack. Her C-reactive protein, so we want it ideally less than 1. She's at 3.9. There are enough markers pulling together that the indication is that she is 100% headed towards diabetes and cardiovascular dysfunction. So we look at it, blood sugar regulation, 100% likely. All of her markers are showing that. Her liver function, showing that it's likely that that is going to happen. Her thyroid function is showing that she is probably in dysfunction. And at this rate, she is elevating her risk factors for cardiovascular disease. Some of these other ones, not a big deal, but these were big deals. And there were a couple other ones I don't remember off the top of my head. I pulled the C-reactive protein. Just by looking at her numbers, I'm guessing she's in menopause. But these are things that will 100% get dismissed by a doctor. And these are things that we can fix with lifestyle, stress management, nutrition, movement, getting enough sleep. Yes, maybe some supplements. You know, these are all things that you can do from a lifestyle standpoint that 100%, if not corrected, will affect the way that she ages. She's 56. It will 100% affect what the next 20 to 30 years look like for her. So I wanted to let you guys see, like, this is pretty standard when I get these back. And then lastly, I'm going to show you guys, hold on, let me close some of these. I have a PDF for the most common conditions, so you can see them grouped. I did not preview this in time, and there are some things that are missing. So let me make sure this is showing. Hopefully you guys can see that. Common conditions by lab. So when you see these together, there's some missing. I'm gonna, my assistant missed some of these, so I'm gonna have her go back and add them back in. But conditions that I commonly see is PCOS. I get a lot of women who say, I've been diagnosed with PCOS, and a lot of times that could just be because the doctor doesn't know any better. But these are some of the panels that would indicate that you might have PCOS. And I actually have 2 clients that when we looked at them, I'm like, yeah, you're there. Luteinizing hormone, FSH, DHEAs. When she came to me, her testosterone was a total mess. She was very androgen based. Her insulin markers, her blood sugar markers were really off. She had a lot of inflammation. And so when we look at what we do with her, it's going to be slightly different than somebody else because she is, number 1, insulin resistant, and number 2, very, very stress sensitive. And she's not even in her 40s yet. That's from PCOS. Thyroid, sorry, these are all combined together. They should not be. When you're looking at thyroid, things that could be off are your vitamin D, your C-reactive protein, and then your TSH and your free T3, your free T4. Reverse T3 is good to have. It's not as necessary. And then, of course, cortisol, if that's off, that's all going to, if they're combined together showing off, that could indicate that you might have some thyroid dysfunction. Low testosterone, it's going to affect you. Men and women are different, but just keep in mind that women do need testosterone. So these are things that could indicate that your testosterone is low, as well as your testosterone being low. Cardiovascular issues, you're looking at vitamin D, your C-reactive protein, fasting insulin, and then again, your HDL to LDL and triglycerides, that ratio, your ApoB. Those are things that you can get on a normal test. Your homocysteine, sometimes they'll run it, sometimes not. Your lipoprotein, calcium score, usually they'll run these if there's a problem here. Then they'll dig a little bit deeper and run those. But when you start having multiple markers come in, it's like, okay, I know that I need to keep an eye on this. Autoimmunity, most of your doctors, unless there's something coming up in your CBC, they won't necessarily run these. You won't see these a lot. TPO, you can ask for. It's an antibody that will show in your system. And so sometimes that will be indicative of something going on. That's how they can find things like Hashimoto's. So that's that one. Your CRP is your C-reactive protein, your vitamin D, which again, and then your CBC. So those are going to show up there. And then usually they'll run these. And then insulin resistance, insulin levels, ferritin levels, your hemoglobin, A1C, vitamin D, C-reactive protein, fasting glucose, and then your triglycerides and your HDL, so your lipid panel. So these are all things that when you're looking at, and I'll give you guys the updated. I need her to finish. She's missing a page when she sent this to me. So I will, sorry, I didn't catch it in time, but I will get the list to you. So the ones that you're going to see the most in terms of women in midlife are going to be insulin resistance, cardiovascular health, inflammation will show up. I get that a lot. I get a lot of liver dysfunction. Gut issues will show up externally. You just are bloated and you have gut issues, but it'll show up on a lab marker by inflammation and infection first. And then we can order things like enzymes and see, do you have protease, amylase? Do you have these things, these proteins that actually help break down the food in your gut so that you can actually get the nutrients from the food that you're eating? And then of course, dropping sex hormones are the ones that I see the most. And then lastly, if you take this list to your doctor and they don't run the panels that you want, you do have options. There are places that you can just purchase labs. Now, there's a company that I work with that's called Merit Health. I'll actually put it in the chat so you guys can look it up. Whoops. This is, I put it in the chat if you guys want to write it down. Merrick Health is a company that does individual lab panels. So you can literally just go in and like click on stuff, and whatever it is that you want to order, you can order individually. Or I actually have a panel of the ones that I listed, the ones that I recommend you get. I can send you a link and be like, this is what I recommend you get. They're all together. And if you pay out of pocket, it's it's under $290. I believe they only service the United States, and they do not have labs in New Jersey, and they actually use LabCorp. So when I have my clients or myself, when I did this, I order it through Merrick Health. I pay the $287 or whatever it is, and then I can just go into a LabCorp that's near me. Like I don't even have to schedule an appointment. You just go in with a little order. You go in, do it fasting, get it done. I got mine back within 3 days. So I would say 5 to 7 is pretty standard. They send you the lab work back. And then you just need to have somebody interpret it for you. And that is what I do. I take these lab reports, I put them inside of my software system. So like for this client, I will actually print out this PDF for her so she will see exactly where she's at on all of this. And then we come up with protocols based on this. We know based on what I've seen that she has insulin resistance, she has cardiovascular risk factors, she has liver dysfunction. There was another one on there that I was like, we got to really work on this. But I can tell you we're going to start working on her insulin sensitivity first. And so there are protocols that we can follow that have nothing to do with medication. That it's lifestyle. It's how are you eating? What are you eating? Are you moving? Are you eating, whole foods, or are you just eating a bunch of crap? Like we're going to balance this blood sugar out, and more than likely some of those lipid numbers will actually balance themselves out as well. So if you're interested, because I've had people over the last year ask me, is before I only did this for my clients because it was very time intensive for me to take a lab sheet, mark it up, and then connect all the dots, and then be able to print something up to where I could walk my clients through like, okay, this is what we need to do. And I did that for my clients, but I would have people ask me like, can you just do a lab review? And so now that I have this software system, which saves me quite a bit of time, I am offering that as a service. Here, if you're interested, here's how it works. Number one, you need to reach out to me so I can make sure that you have the proper labs. I do have clients that work with their doctors, and if you can get these labs through your doctor and it's covered by insurance, great. I can use those labs, that's fine. It's just you need to understand that most doctors aren't going to run it all. And if you go that route, then we're just missing some information, and that's the choice you make. And then from there, I just take this information, I upload it in the software system, I come up with the protocols that are specific to you and help walk you through what those look like and help you customize those. And so I do offer that as a standalone service if that's something that you guys are interested in. And that's that. So again, Labs 101, hopefully it wasn't too complicated. Is it something that made sense to you guys? Did you learn something new? Did you have questions?